And I don't know about you, but I was so very inspired at the March for Life yesterday. I've heard yeah, it was just incredible. I've heard that the numbers might be bigger than we have ever seen before, and me and the Americans United for Life team, it certainly felt like it. We had to stop 3 times because there were just so many people there, people like you who have come in from all over the country and in cases sometimes all over the world just to come in and make a stand for life and stand up for what's right. You would just see people streaming in from the different streets, and it was just so incredibly inspiring. So I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. And to be able to discuss something that's really important for all of us, that's really near and dear to my heart, and that is the assisted suicide issue. You know, what you might call end of life, even though, as we'll see, it doesn't really need to be always. And I'd like to start with a bit of a story. A couple of years ago, comedian John Oliver was talking about the IRS. Now, apparently, their phone system, if it got overloaded, it would just automatically hang up on you. And they called this a courtesy disconnect. Now, as Oliver said, you can't just put a nice word in front of an unpleasant word and change the meaning. Like courtesy disconnect, what's that? You just hung up on me, right? And the same is true when we're talking about assisted suicide, death with dignity, aid in dying. So many of these different phrases that you see people use, and you're really just putting a nice word in front of an unpleasant one. It's really just an attempt to sugarcoat suicide. Now, in 2014, the last year that we have numbers for, 2,626,418 people died in the United States. Now, 44,193 of those deaths were attributed by the CDC to intentional self-harm, to suicide. That might be a little bit low, as we'll discuss later, but it's a tragic figure. We have public policies in place to combat this, and we've implemented laws, regulations, and guidance against suicide, resources that have helped to keep the suicide rate relatively low, if never as low as we would like for it to be. But suicide is bad. States recognize the significant medical and non-medical costs and the physical, emotional, and psychological damage to patients' families and friends. So let's dig a little bit into 2 of those deaths. First, on August 11th, 2014, actor Robin Williams took his own life. He was our genie, our captain, my captain, our good morning Vietnam. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and it turns out also had Lewy body dementia, early stage. He was also in the midst of a long-term struggle with depression. He committed suicide, and we collectively mourn this tragic, this untimely death, and also specifically his suicide. As studies have shown, losing someone to suicide has a special impact. And in fact, Robin Williams' son has spoke out on the heartbreak he has felt, just the pain he has felt from losing his dad. But then that same year, in the state of California, same state, a young woman received a grim diagnosis of brain cancer. She too did not want to face living any longer, but she decided to enlist the help of a doctor. So she moved to Oregon, a state that, at that point already had legalized assisted suicide. She got her drugs, and she spent her last days campaigning for its legalization. She died on November 1st, less than 3 months after Robin Williams. So we might assume that the news media's response to these 2 deaths would be similar, that they would take some kind of similar approach, right? Both of them are tragic, untimely deaths, but we would be, sadly, wrong. With Robin Williams, the language was visceral. Language like tied belt, slashed wrist, hanged, tortured, money worries, despair, failed, desperate, drugs, drink, depression, disease, demons, agony, sad clown, tragic, way too soon, and it stings. The young woman, in contrast, choice, decision, her own terms, aid in dying. Magazines said that she left this world with 0 regrets. She was inspirational. They said that she reignited debate. And how did she die? The headlines demurely said that she took medicine. Both of these people were facing a terminal illness, and while I'm sure neither wished for mortality or for the dreadful diseases that afflicted them, both elected the time and place of their death within the circumstances they were in, and neither used an especially revolutionary tool to die. Ropes and poison both predate Socrates. But somehow, when you medicalize the procedure, when you get a doctor involved and stamp on the imprimatur of the medical profession, some people start to feel differently, even if the diagnosis is the same, even if the prognosis is the same. An Irish colleague of mine, Kevin Fitzpatrick, he was a paraplegic who eventually succumbed to the ravages of cancer. He told an illustrative story. He said, when non-disabled people say they despair of their future, suicide prevention is the default service we must provide. Disabled people, by contrast, feel the seductive, easy arm of the few supposedly trusted medical professionals around their shoulder. Someone who says, well, you've done enough. No one would blame you. In America, it has been a long time since we even thought of prosecuting someone for committing or attempting suicide. Those laws are off the books, but most states do, in fact, have laws against urging or helping someone else to commit suicide. To do so smacks of a death culture, of potential coercion or abuse or even homicide. And many states passed those laws in the wake of the exposure of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, specifically to prevent people from being pressured by doctors into death. So in essence, what assisted suicide does is license professionals who are given the power to decide which lives are worth living, which people are eligible for death. Rather than protect patients or people generally, it protects one particular profession from prosecution for hurrying along death. So today we're going to just delve into some of the fatal flaws of assisted suicide, the law on assisted suicide, why the public and legislatures are pushing back and rejecting assisted suicide bills, a quick deep dive into one legalized assisted suicide model, and strategies to counter the push of assisted suicide activists. So first, how does assisted suicide work? Generally, laws legalizing assisted suicide have an application process to obtain the lethal drug, and the process typically involves a written request form with 2 required witnesses. One of the witnesses can usually be the person's heir who would stand to inherit and would benefit from the death, but the other one generally has to be someone else, okay? Then once the drug is dispensed, there is no longer any supervision of what happens to it, no requirement that the death be witnessed by neutral, disinterested parties, or in fact by anyone at all. In the US, where is assisted suicide legal? First, in Oregon, starting in 1997, in Washington, 2009, Vermont, 2013, California, 2015, Colorado, 2016, DC, 2017, and just now, Hawaii, 2019. And the bill was passed last year, last legislative session. Now, some assisted suicide proponents also claim Montana as a state where assisted suicide is legal, but the Montana Supreme Court in 2009 merely allowed a possible consent defense to murder charges. And in Morris v. King, a judge in New Mexico legalized assisted suicide in only one county, despite, again, state law making it a felony to assist in a suicide. But we won before the New Mexico Supreme Court, and we reclaimed New Mexico. But our Supreme Court has found that for over 700 years, the Anglo-American common law tradition has punished or otherwise disapproved of both suicide and prescribed suicide. And by that, they mean assisted suicide. There's different terms used for it. In fact, we're moving more and more towards suicide by physician, just to call it what it is. You know, you hear in the news media about suicide by cop. Suicide by physician is another term that we're starting to use. So the Supreme Court found, that the states, the Anglo-American common law tradition, does not approve of suicide or prescribed suicide. The U.S. Constitution does not provide any right to assisted suicide, and there is no federal law on the subject. There are 2 big Supreme Court cases on assisted suicide, and they do continue to protect us. The Supreme Court gets it. They said that a ban on assisted suicide furthers compelling state interests, like the preservation of human life and protection from medical malpractice, coercion, financial pressure, and psychological complications. And further, the Supreme Court said that if it declared assisted suicide a constitutionally protected right, that we would start down the road towards voluntary and perhaps even involuntary euthanasia. The vast majority of U.S. states, in contrast, do have a specific statute in place prohibiting assisting in someone else's suicide. And that's true even in Oregon and Washington. They simply decided to make exceptions for one particular type of professional. And again, many of these bans were enacted in the mid-1990s in the wake of the Jack Kevorkian scandal. So legislatively, assisted suicide is not an idea whose time has come. In fact, assisted suicide bills have failed about 200 times in well over half the states. And from those 20 years of effort since Oregon, only a handful of states have been willing to risk it. In fact, 6 states have decided it was, 6 jurisdictions, 5 states and DC, decided that it was worth the risk. In that same period of time, 10 states decided to affirmatively ban it because they saw the threat that was coming down the road, and they said, you know what, we're going to just go ahead and make sure that that can't happen in our state. We're going to protect our state's citizens from coercion and from abuse. In fact, assisted suicide failed 5 times in California before it was pushed through. And even in Washington, prescribed suicide, assisted suicide proponents had to try over and over before it was enacted. New Hampshire has overwhelmingly rejected assisted suicide. And in 2014, they had a vote of 219 to 66. And the courts have almost universally supported these prohibitions. In fact, in the last couple of years, we've won in the courts in California, New Mexico, New York, and Tennessee. But that's not to say its proponents aren't still trying. Just as here in the US, assisted suicide and euthanasia have long been rejected worldwide, with just a few exceptions. And again, it's just due to this push. We see that the modern debate on assisted suicide and euthanasia began in the late 19th century. In fact, its proponents began to propose legislation that would legalize one or both of those practices, but it was defeated until 1942, when Switzerland, the first to legalize nearly 80 years ago, decriminalized assistance in suicide where there were no, what they termed, selfish motives. Now today, Switzerland is in fact a destination for so-called suicide tourism, where people will actually travel to Switzerland in pursuit of this kind of death. The next major changes in the law came in the mid-1990s, when Australia briefly legalized suicide in the Northern Territory, and then quickly became the first and only place to repeal it. Also in the mid-1990s in Colombia, the courts ruled that euthanasia on request was legal, but Colombia passed no law on the matter, so it wasn't really in effect in practice. Then through the 2000s, we saw another big push. We saw the Netherlands, we saw Belgium legalizing euthanasia in 2002, and Luxembourg in 2009. But we're still only looking at 4 of the 50 European countries. In the last couple of years, Colombia in 2015 did eventually enact a law in response to that 1990s court ruling, and Canada in 2016. There's a continuing push in Australia. I went down there and worked with lawmakers and advocates trying to push back and prevent assisted suicide from coming to Australia. But then there are other nations that are less clear. For example, there have been lawsuits in New Zealand and South Africa. And in South Africa, the High Court in Pretoria actually granted a right to assisted suicide for one terminally ill lawyer, but fortunately that didn't apply to anyone else, and so it did not set precedent, but still you saw that exception there. We also look at Germany, at South Korea, the Australian state of Victoria, just this continued push, this continued attempt to advance these assisted suicide bills in the law by these assisted suicide activists. Nonetheless, it has failed around the world. It has failed in Australia repeatedly, in France, in New Zealand, in Scotland, at the European Court of Human Rights, just to name a few, as well as we discussed, in the United States broadly, nationally, and in state after state after state. And why is that? In short, assisted suicide is bad public policy. Many polls have found concerns about pressure to die, the risk of inaccurate diagnosis, a reduction in end-of-life options, the expansion of assisted suicide, sloppy procedures on the part of doctors. People are worried that the focus will be on saving money, not on saving lives. And legislators are listening. When you look at why people have elected assisted suicide, studies have shown that for most, the answer is not pain, and it's not fear of pain. Bioethicist Ezekiel Emanuel summarizes that the reason is typically depression, hopelessness, and fear of loss of autonomy and control. He writes, in this light, assisted suicide looks less like a good death in the face of unremitting pain, and more like plain old suicide. In Oregon, one study specifically states that depression as a factor for requesting assisted suicide is being overlooked. The National Alliance on Mental Illness states that depression affects one's thoughts, feelings, behavior, mood, and physical health. Amid this vulnerability, patients are being entrusted with the decision of whether or not they wish to die. And yet the bills we've seen have no psychological screening requirement, only a circular requirement to refer for counseling if the attending physician believes the patient needs counseling. It doesn't happen nearly often enough. In fact, non-psychiatric physicians do not even believe themselves capable of adequately evaluating the need for counseling. In one study, 94% indicated that they could not determine whether a psychiatric disorder was impairing the judgment of a patient who requested assisted suicide. Then, even when doctors know that a patient's judgment is impaired, they can't always save him. The patient can just doctor shop, and this is actually happening. We've seen different patients, different people who considered going to different doctors, and in fact, there's one woman. Her name is Jeanette Hall, and she has a beautiful story. She went to her doctor. She was diagnosed with cancer, and he didn't believe in assisted suicide. He's just a major voice for life in the movement now. But she went to him and she said, "Okay, I have cancer. I give up. I can't go on anymore." And he said, "Well, let me just talk to you. Let me get to know you. What are you looking forward to? What is the thing that you're most looking forward to in your future?" And she said, "Well, seeing my son's graduation. I really would love to see that graduation, but there's no way I'll make it to that because, I'm going to die first." And he said, "Well, what if you don't have to? What if we try treatment? What if we just, give this a try? What if we see what can happen?" And so she did. And now 18 years later, she is still alive. She is touring the world and just speaking out on this issue, on the risks and the scourge of assisted suicide, and saying, I made it. There is hope. There is hope out there. Other patients we've seen who were at risk for assisted suicide got talked out of it, but were at risk for doctor shopping. We're talking about doctor shopping. The ones who did not go on to actually request those drugs, you'll see them live sometimes for years and just lives full of hope, full of possibility, and being able to see their kids' graduations. So one of them actually almost died once a few years later, but it was in a hot air balloon accident. So she just has been able to live just a very full and fulfilling life. So you see that doctor shopping can be a risk, because when you have doctors who are more ideologically involved and who are saying, well, of course, we'll go ahead and give you the drug, and don't necessarily discuss treatment options, then people can be at risk. And that's troubling, because when a patient is suffering from depression, removal of lethal means is central to treating the patient. You build the relationship, you remove the lethal means, you give hope, you build a bridge. But the very point of assisted suicide is to hand over the gun. And decisions to commit assisted suicide may often be influenced by misdiagnosis. Around 15% of diagnoses are incorrect globally, and more than 40% for disorders of consciousness. This rate has not changed despite medical advances over the last 15 years. Prognoses as well are often wrong. 17%, at least 17% of patients, according to one recent study. And the real-world stories, again, support the claims made by experts in the field, stories like those of Jeanette Hall and some of these other people who we've seen dramatically outlive their prognoses. And yet, many individuals do face coercion. They're exposed to physicians who perhaps don't offer treatment options. They may face economic duress from insurance companies, from facilities, even from family members. And they may face social duress due to loneliness, due to feeling like a burden. And when we look at the protections in place where assisted suicide has been legalized, they are wholly inadequate. Patients can doctor shop. If the patient gets counseling, the purpose of the evaluation is solely to determine competence, not to counsel or treat. Competence is only required to request the drug, then it can be handed off to anyone. There's no competence required to actually ingest the drug. The witnesses to the request could be an heir and his cousin, an heir and his best friend. No witnesses are required at the time of the actual ingestion, so there is no assurance that the act was voluntary throughout, or even self-administered. And actually, when you look at the law, there is no requirement, when you really parse the language, there's no requirement that it actually be self-administered when you look at the language. And even a patient who did begin the process by legitimate self-administration, he or she may become incapacitated during that process, and someone else may step in. The lethal agents may be dispensed to an agent, not only to the patient or his physician, and then no one knows what happens to them. There's a tracking process in the law, but just like the leftover unused antibiotics that are so often found in medicine cabinets, tracking doesn't always happen. And again, self-administered doesn't necessarily mean that the person will administer the lethal dose to himself. There's no requirement that only the person may administer the dose. Instead, self-administer is defined as the patient's act of ingesting. And so in Washington, for example, the Assisted Suicide Act states, self-administer means a qualified patient's act of ingesting medication to end his or her life. Well, that act of ingesting, it could simply be the swallowing. It could be just that very physical act, but not as self-administration. Then, second fatal flaw, just the process. When someone actually goes to commit assisted suicide, he has to choke down one of two kinds of barbiturates, the same that have led to public outcry and outrage over some of the botched executions. These are bitter drugs, and they usually take 3 to 48 hours to kill. Vomiting is common. Some patients have regained consciousness after taking the drugs, and 1 in 5 patients don't die from the drugs at all. So put simply, death by assisted suicide, even assisted by a doctor, can be excruciating, even humiliating. It doesn't always work out to be what you may think of as death with dignity. Third, we discussed public policy and efforts against suicide. There's also a phenomenon known as suicide contagion, scientifically called the Werther Effect, after Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Studies have shown that media coverage of suicide inspires more suicides, and there's a lot of different aspects of that, a lot of different guidelines for what specifically should be covered and what shouldn't be, what can actually harm the public. But the latest such study, which was published on the same day that Governor Jerry Brown signed the California bill, it demonstrates that legalizing assisted suicide in other states has led to a rise in the overall suicide rates, assisted and unassisted, in those states. The study's key findings show that after controlling for demographic and socioeconomic factors and other state-specific issues, physician-assisted suicide is associated with a 6.3% increase in total suicide rates. And that effect is even greater for individuals older than 65, where you see a 14% increase. But that doesn't surprise anyone familiar with the literature on the social contagion effects of suicidal behavior. You simply don't discourage suicide by assisting suicide. Journalism students are taught the harm of suicide reporting, and there are strict reporting guidelines. We've seen celebrity suicides that have inspired more suicides. In fact, some people have even killed themselves at celebrity funerals. After Saddam Hussein was hanged, the rate of young men in Iraq hanging themselves rose. And there's a link between, again, assisted suicide and suicide more generally. We saw in Oregon, the suicide rate has skyrocketed since they legalized assisted suicide. But interestingly, there is a converse effect, whereby reporting on people with suicidal ideation who do not then go on to commit suicide, that inspires others to follow suit. So when you build relationships and share positive stories of people who went through tough times but came through it and just found hope again, it can be tremendously, tremendously powerful. And that's why one of my favorite songs that's come out over the last couple of years is the Logic song. And the name of the song is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number. And you saw after he performed it at the Grammys, the percentage of calls to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline just skyrocketed. We're talking about a couple of 100%, and that rate has remained high ever since, because the song talks about someone who did have suicidal ideation, someone who was going through a very rough patch, and then found hope, and then built relationships, regained a community, and found hope. Another problem with assisted suicide, we've seen that jurisdictions with legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia, they also show higher rates of elder abuse. Assisted suicide simply creates broader opportunities for elder exploitation and the abuse of individuals with disabilities. Further, when it comes to assisted suicide, the slippery slope concerns are real. We've seen that voluntary leads to involuntary, leads to really involuntary. And in fact, Belgium, half the people are being euthanized without an explicit request. Euthanasia is being expanded to children in Europe. Terminality 6 months leads to 12 months or 2 years, leads to disease, leads to malaise. In Oregon, several years ago, there was a push and a bill introduced to extend the 6-month prognosis to a year. And so we're seeing this over and over and over. And in fact, there was a bill introduced in Washington State that same year that would have at least said, okay, if you're going to counsel a patient on assisted suicide, you also have to tell them about the treatment options, because it was found that that wasn't always happening. And unfortunately, it failed. So even such a basic common sense law that would just ensure that patients knew about treatment options was not able to make it through, was not able to get passed into law. And Dr. Peter Saunders has observed that in practice, these boundaries are continually migrating, and the nation's moral conscience is shifting year on year. Call it incremental extension, mission creep, or slippery slope, whatever, he writes, it is strongly in evidence in Belgium. There have been errors, mistakes in diagnosis, uncertainties. There's no accountability. There was one man who chose assisted suicide in Europe. They performed an autopsy on him, and they discovered that he had no disease at all. He was a perfectly healthy man, and yet we're seeing just this expansion to a broader and broader scope of what you could call disability or other reasons for choosing this. One study found that in the Flemish part of Belgium, 1/3 of euthanasia cases occurred without consent. Big surprise, legal requirements aren't always being met, and more, and especially in those unreported cases. And a written request for euthanasia was absent in 88% of those cases. This is not autonomy. It's not choice. It's government-authorized agents cherry-picking who can live and who can die. Case in point, the Oregon Health Authority recently admitted the question is, should the disease be allowed to take its course absent further treatment? Is the patient likely to die within 6 months? Going on, I think you could also argue that even if the treatment medication could actually cure the disease and the patient cannot pay for the treatment, then the disease remains incurable. So at that point, you're looking at assisted suicide in the US for something like diabetes. Something where if you just don't take medicine and don't go about a normal course of treatment, you could die. Or if you can't pay for it, you could die. And we've seen that in evidence as well, where you have insurance companies at times offering to pay $400 for the assisted suicide drugs, but refusing to pay, say, $4,000 for a cancer treatment. And increasingly, proponents don't even conceal the end game. We have already seen voluntarily stopping eating and drinking by someone who was, the quote is, essentially healthy. Pro-VSCD activist doctors, though, they've called the process horrific, and one patient's daughter termed it torture. But rather than contemplate appropriate medical care, treatment, palliative care, some have suggested a better way. And their better way is assisted suicide and euthanasia. They said, well, you wouldn't put a dog through this, you would give it a lethal injection. Finally, physicians. They are worried about assisted suicide as a threat to their profession and a threat to their conscience. Assisted suicide laws and bills contain, at best, the most limited conscience protection for doctors to avoid coercive or even mandatory participation in death. And these are the same healing professionals who swore to first do no harm. In fact, most versions of the Hippocratic Oath have physicians swear, "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel." Prescribing fatal medication with the express intent to kill flies in the face of that duty. And the very integrity of the profession depends on its ability to use the best practices with the best information to promote patient well-being. Again, the U.S. Supreme Court has stated that the government undoubtedly has an interest in protecting the integrity and ethics of the medical profession. And so, as Justice Scalia wrote, virtually every relevant source of authoritative meaning confirms that the phrase legitimate medical purpose does not include intentionally assisting suicide. Medicine refers to the science and art dealing with the prevention, cure, or alleviation of disease. And he goes on to write, the AMA has determined that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. Of course, now, pressured by assisted suicide activists, we're seeing more and more medical associations debate and consider going neutral on this critical issue. And that is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. But even in Switzerland, we see that same sentiment that was espoused by the Supreme Court ringing true. One study found that although most of the doctors in Switzerland, most of the doctors that they polled approved of assisted suicide, but most were unwilling to actually do it. And yet some medical associations, again, are considering going neutral, even though the majority of actual doctors are not interested in engaging in that. And in fact, in DC, although there are 11,000 licensed physicians in DC, there's a list, a registry, where you have to register in order to prescribe assisted suicide drugs, and only 2 physicians, the last time I had checked a couple of months ago, only 2 physicians have actually signed up to be on that registry. And the number of patients who've actually asked for assisted suicide, the number of patients who've requested and availed themselves of this law, even though it's been legal for more than a year, 0. So that's the good news. But nonetheless, some medical associations have contemplated forcing doctors to either assist or refer for assisted suicide. Pharmacists as well are very concerned. You know, pharmacies, they only stock a small percentage of all the available drugs on the market at any given time. And that makes sense, given the huge variety of drugs and their limited shelf life. And yet we've seen lawsuits where the government intrudes into pharmacy stockrooms, tells them what drugs they must order and stock, when the patient could just walk down the street to the next pharmacy and get that same drug that a different pharmacy would have in stock. So as relates to assisted suicide, if a pharmacy manager decided, whether because of demand or hassle or belief, not to stock these assisted suicide drugs, he could bring down the wrath of the state. And coroners. Coroners are being required to lie on death certificates, listing the patient's disease, not the drug, as the cause of death. In fact, that's one of the very points of assisted suicide, to have the death listed as something other than suicide. But where assisted suicide has been legalized, a suicide with a doctor involved cannot be termed a suicide. And so the president of the California State Coroners Association expressed concerns about how to classify such a death. After the bill passed, he wrote an open letter, and he asked, what should we do if a guy takes life-ending drugs and then goes to sit in a park to die and we find him there? Should they do an autopsy? And if the death certificate lists a disease and not assisted suicide is the cause of death, it could create a legal inability to prosecute criminal behavior, preventing prosecutions for murder and other crimes, as well as affecting civil suits. But really, no safeguard could ever be enough. Australian Paul Russell has written, "I have never come across a safeguard that could guarantee safety for vulnerable people. After all, unless we describe in the law every possible illness and every possible remedy, what possibility is there that we can ensure safety? The variables are infinite. What the supposed safeguards do well is to protect doctors. They are protected with an immunity from prosecution for homicide or assisting in suicide if they comply with a set of procedures." Yet as we see, this push is continuing in the legislatures, in the courts. They're pushing in culture with movies. There was the documentary, How to Die in Oregon, just a heartbreaking depiction of one person's process and desire and eventual death due to assisted suicide. We're seeing other documentaries. We're seeing more mainstream movies. I'm a bit of a movie buff, and I collect, being in the life movement, I collect all the different movies on life issues there are, whether it's abortion or bioethics or, Gattaca or assisted suicide. And so I have How to Die in Oregon. I've watched that. Another one that's out there is called Youth in Oregon. And this movie, it actually depicts a sort of almost a buddy comedy, a road trip, an assisted suicide journey. I haven't brought myself to watch it, but I'll keep you up to date if I do. But they're doing this. They're pushing in the culture. They're pushing in the press. They're contributing to candidates, and they have millions upon millions of dollars to do it with, just a massive war chest. And so recent media coverage like the young woman in California, coverage like what we've seen out of Hawaii, out of DC, out of Colorado, and some of these states that have decided to risk assisted suicide, it has led some assisted suicide advocates to declare premature victory, describing assisted suicide as having reached a threshold where it is unstoppable. But few bills have gotten any traction. In fact, in Connecticut, the bill has failed time and time again. It failed to get a single committee vote in consecutive years, despite its proponents spending over $500,000. And each year it's actually gone backward. Compassion and Choices has publicly admitted that if the bill had been voted on in Connecticut, it would have set the movement in Connecticut back by years. And again, we're seeing other states. So some states are refusing to pass it, states like Connecticut. Other states are affirmatively banning it and saying, no, we specifically mean doctors. When the assisted suicide movement comes into court, when they bring a lawsuit and they say there's a right to assisted suicide in our state or our federal constitution, they'll try to make that argument. And often they will say, well, the state law that bans assisted suicide, that was meant to apply to you and me. But not to doctors, obviously, not those trusted medical professionals. They can be entrusted with this. But in fact, when you look back at the legislative record, so often you see, especially those ones passed in the mid-1990s, those bills were passed specifically because of doctors, because of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, because states were concerned that assisted suicide would spread and that specifically doctors would be prescribing these kinds of drugs to their patients. So it does apply to you and me, but it also applies specifically to doctors. Moreover, we have seen public support plateauing on this issue. It's an issue where people can be easily swayed. They have a great marketing machine at their hands. People will hear a story about a really tragic situation, a story like that young woman from California, and no one can deny that it was a tragic situation. But the answer to that is not assisted suicide. The answer is greater patient protection, greater care, greater relationship building and bridge building, and finding a path forward together. That is the way that we can prevent both patients and their families from being put in these kinds of situations. And so in the end, whatever the circumstances and the catchphrases that are employed, assisted suicide isn't about choice, it's not about dignity. It's government-endorsed suicide. It's guided by a trusted medical professional. Assisted suicide is dangerous to all involved, is dangerous with the drugs left behind, is dangerous to you and to me, but we've seen amazing victories. Victories like that in Connecticut. Connecticut is one of my favorite states to talk about. There's a family policy council there. There are so many good pro-life advocates there that are doing incredible things for life. And one of the ways that they've done that is simply engaging with their state lawmakers and with the news media. And what they'll do is when there's a hearing, they'll find out about it, they'll get the word out. They start tweeting at reporters. Reporters love getting tweets at them, or they certainly use it anyway. And so all of these reporters find out about it. They start listening to the message that there is hope, to all of the message from life advocates, instead of just the talking points from the pro-assisted suicide crowd. So that will help a lot. Connecting with lawmakers, getting to know them, talking to them about the issue of assisted suicide, again, contacting them by phone, by Twitter, by mail, by email, showing up in person, finding out what's going on about the life issue in your state, engaging in capital lobbying days, engaging in street advocacy, praying if you're a person of faith, all the different kinds of ways that we can connect with lawmakers, we can connect with the media and just start to spread that message, almost like what we discussed with the Papageno effect, where if you share and spread that message of hope, the person with suicidal ideation who does not then go on to commit suicide, but instead chooses life, then you're still spreading that message. And the same goes for the news media, goes for state lawmakers. The more they understand the issue, the more they understand the risks, and hear it from the people who are most at risk, the more they realize this is not a partisan issue. It's not an issue where it's Republican versus Democrat. This is something that everyone can get behind, because we all care about patients, we all care about outcomes, we all care about people. And assisted suicide is dangerous. It is dangerous to all of us, to patients, but to all of us as we may be put into different situations. There are solutions that we can live with, and it's up to us all to work together to find and enact those solutions. Thank you. If there are any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes. Hi.
My name's Lisa. I'm a hospice nurse, and I just wanted to recommend a couple of movies to the young people. One, Fatal Flaws.
Yes.
Which is about assisted suicide, and it will give you a real good understanding about that slippery slope that we're talking about, and how it started, and how it's ended in Sweden, and what we're trying to not have happen here. And another movie, Being Mortal, that will show you a different side of dying, and that it's okay, and that there are ways to help people die with dignity, but not that kind of dignity.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes, I strongly recommend, and in fact, speaking of Fatal Flaws, we were involved in that. I was part of that process. So both Fatal Flaws and the Euthanasia Deception, both produced, filmed by the same organization, both excellent films. We worked with Alex Schadenberg of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I don't remember if it was mentioned in my bio, but I'm former executive director of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition USA. Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is a great organization put together in collaboration with Dunn Media, just a couple of excellent films that really expose the lie of assisted suicide. Yeah.
I had a quick question. Do you think that the recent trends that you've been talking about, are they more doctor-driven, or are they more driven by people who are seeking to commit suicide? In other words, people have been committing suicide for a long time, but this is a relatively new trend. Do you think that's doctors responding to a demand? Do you think it's doctors coming up with a new solution?
Yeah, I would say neither, actually, because when you look at the trends, actually, you look at, for example, DC. DC is the first majority-minority jurisdiction to enact assisted suicide, the first jurisdiction where a majority of the population is a minority. And having worked on this issue, having worked in DC with the population here to try to fight back against this and educate just the folks out there, there was a tremendous concern on the part of that population about what was going on. Then you look at DC also, and just those numbers, the statistics on the number of physicians who are eligible to practice in DC, 11,000, only 2 have registered to be eligible to actually prescribe assisted suicide drugs, and no patients have actually availed themselves of the law. So we often see that this isn't especially patient-driven, not especially doctor-driven either. In so many cases, it appears to be really activist-driven.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Really appreciate you being here, and let's go fight this. Thank you.